Pioneer brand canola with Optimum Gly, the highest yielding glyphosate tolerant trait on the market. What's next in canola happens here.
I'm Lindsay Smith with Real Agriculture and Real Ag Radio, and joining me now, it's Jean-Michel DeVink. He is an independent consultant, a biologist, and an adjunct professor at the School of Environmental and Sustainability with the University of Saskatchewan. Welcome here, Jean-Michel.
Thanks, Lindsay. Nice to be here.
Okay, so let's talk about, first and foremost, we're going to talk about grasslands. We're going to talk about their value and their conservation, frankly. Let's start, we're going to back up a little bit and talk about what does a natural grassland in Canada's West, what does it look like? What's it function? What do we need to know about our grasslands?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and I think if you would ask most Canadians to drive through the prairies and to point out, native grasslands or natural prairie, they'd probably struggle, right? Because to most people that drive across the prairies that, I speak to anecdotally, they tend to say it's just a sea of grass. It's just wide open spaces. And it's interesting because after spending over 20 years living here, moving out from the Maritimes, it was really eye-opening to see the diversity of the landscape and the prairies. Now, across the Canadian prairies, there's a variety of grassland ecosystems that kind of fall within, the prairie ecozone. So we've got the tall grass prairies of, say, Manitoba, a lot taller because it's got a lot more moisture. So you've got certain species of grasses that would grow there. You've got the prairie parkland ecosystem that kind of borders, it's the transitional zone from the boreal into more of the grasslands themselves. There you'll find aspen forests and mixed with grasses and stuff. And then as you head sort of further west, you get into drier climates and you get into the moist mixed grasslands, and then the mixed grasslands, and then the short grass prairies. So it's quite a variety, and it really depends on sort of the local climate, and the topography and the types of soils.
Now,
So, go
sorry,
ahead.
so to me, you're right. So I'm from the West, and when I meet people who have driven across the West who are not from there, they say, well, there's nothing there. It's just flat. And I just bristle because there's lots there. You just have to go and actually explore it a little bit. But as you explained, I mean, grassland is a general term, but there are actually different ecoregions within them. And it largely for Western Canada, I mean, that was what developed there over time. And explain to me a bit about, because we're going to talk about conserving some of these grasslands. Explain to me a bit about the function of a grassland. So the animals that we would naturally find there, the kind of habitat that is conserved there in a natural state.
Sure. And so, when you think about those types of ecosystems, and largely most ecosystems, it's not unlike in the boreal where, in the boreal you have large fires well, as we've seen recently, enormous fires that'll burn large areas. The prairies were kind of similar, right? And so the reason that there's grass is that there's generally lower moisture than you would find up in the boreal. So places that, trees would have a little bit of a hard time growing because they just don't have enough moisture to suck up to support such a tall species of vegetation. You see the trees around wetlands where they have access to more water. And then as you get into the drier areas, you tend to find just shorter grasses and shorter grasses. But fire was a natural disturbance, and so that would burn large areas, and of course grasses, because they're a perennial species, and they'll grow back up, and there's some annual species of plants as well, but they basically rejuvenate, and the grasslands will restore themselves fairly quickly. Indigenous communities across the prairies learn to use fire actually for management, and to not only attract but for management of some of the herds of bison. So it was, it's an interesting system, and of course, the I think the estimates were around 50 million bison head that would roam the grasslands, and seeking out areas that were the most lush and had the best vegetation, and moving with the seasons as well. that was a huge natural disturbance as well, and that resulted in, patterns of grasslands in different states. The property that I live on is basically been left fallow for probably the last 30 years. It used to be grazed. And it's interesting because you look back there and you see a lot of this shrubby vegetation that's starting to establish itself. So snowberry, which would kind of look like the height of a blueberry bush kind of thing. Then you get buffalo berries, and you get some other shrubs and some trees that are starting to establish as well. And that's because there hasn't been that either fire or grazing disturbance there for a long time. So you have that natural succession, and maintaining the grasslands really does depend on proper management and the use of largely of large herbivores like bison or cattle in modern times anyways is the more common surrogate species.
So, and one of the things that you've written about recently is the threat of losing this incredible amount of grasslands. We already have, I shouldn't say it's lost. It's not like it fell into a hole and we can't find it. We know where it is. It's that the grassland, the native prairie, has been turned into several different things, among them cropland. But of course, we would have golf courses and towns and cities and all sorts of different things that have, of course, spread over Western Canada and in the process have taken up these grasslands. So there is this friction, obviously, with development, with trying to make a living, with also conserving our grasslands. So first, let's talk about, from your perspective, you feel very strongly that, there's a lot of global attention to things like the Amazon rainforest or the Great Barrier Reef and some of these other areas that potentially have or need to be protected. But the grasslands don't get that same kind of play. Is it because they're boring? Do you think? Because maybe
well, I think you're asking the wrong person or a bit of a loaded question.
You're right.
But
yeah, no. Okay,
no, absolutely. Yeah. And to caveat that a little bit, when I mentioned some of the species that live there, the bison were very well adapted to the prairies, but it wasn't just bison, right? There's entire ecosystems from invertebrates, right? The bugs that live there that adapted, some species that only will feed on individual plants and that only lay their eggs on one species of plant because they are so adapted to that, and became so specialized there that there's an enormous amount of biodiversity that we find within the natural prairie landscape and the native grasslands. I absolutely acknowledge that, we need food production. We need, places to live. We need to have a bit of balance there at the same time. But one of the challenges we face is that, they write songs about flyover states. Well, the flyover states are basically the southern extension of the Canadian prairies, right? It's the broader Great Plains of North America where there used to be, larger herds of animals that used to roam than the African plains, right? We see all these videos on, whether it's or National Geographic or whatnot about, the African plains, but it's like, imagine that and at a larger extent, and that was the Canadian plains way back when, or the Great Plains of North America. And so it's, I don't think there's necessarily been enough attention brought to it. It's a topic that's certainly gaining more and more attention and more recognition as something that we need to better understand. But also, I think we have enough knowledge to know the next steps in terms of landscape management. And I think that there are opportunities there. But just to put it in perspective, right, when we talk about the Amazon rainforest and forget what the estimates are, I think maybe 30% of the forest has been, impacted to date. It might be more. Don't quote me on that number, but to give you some perspective, in Manitoba, the tall grass prairies of Manitoba, which is rich, fertile soils, there's only about 5% of the native grasslands that are left of that tall grass prairie. And it's largely left in areas that are, less suitable for agricultural, row crop production. Those are usually in the sand dune areas that would have been formed, in old, a long time ago during the geological shifts and changes. And it's the same kind of story for Saskatchewan, Alberta as well, where we still see remaining grassland. And Saskatchewan has about 14 to 15% of the native grassland left. Alberta is a little bit better, usually like somewhere to 35 to 40%. And the specific estimates are sometimes hard because one, things are changing with things getting plowed up, but it's also sometimes hard to get an exact estimate because sometimes tame grassland or tame grasses, right, hay fields and stuff can look from imagery can actually look like native, and you need ground truthing, and there's a little margin of error there. That's why I say approximate. But we know, 14 to 15% of native grasslands in Saskatchewan. I mean, it's still a small amount, and it's usually in areas that are very hard to turn over and actually produce something viable in terms of row crop production. I mean, back in the day when the Palliser expedition back in the 1800s came out to Western Canada, kind of survey and get a sense of the area. There's an area of kind of like Saskatchewan, southwestern Alberta that's called the Palliser Triangle, and they deemed that basically unsuitable for agriculture. The other kind of concept that's interesting to think about when it comes to grasslands, from a historic context, and this actually draws from Europe and ancient Roman times, is the idea of improved and unimproved land. Well, even Statistics Canada, I think, still considers areas of unimproved land, which is basically natural landscape. Yet, some of the members of Palliser's expedition group actually wrote back to Eastern Canada and said they were amazed at how well animals and primarily the horses that they were using to get out there were actually doing on that native prairie. The grasses were so nutritious that their animals could gain like almost 2 pounds a day in the spring. So it was incredible, but that information was largely ignored because the focus was on basically turning over the soil, right, and homesteading, and creating row crop agriculture. So from that perspective, I mean, to think that there's anywhere from 5 to 35% of the native grasslands left, it's really not a surprise that the vast majority of the species at risk in Saskatchewan, and we've got 107 species at risk that were either extirpated, extinct, endangered, threatened, or special concern. In Saskatchewan, I think 45 of those are birds, for instance. And there's a lot of those species that the reason that they're endangered species is because we've basically removed their home, right? Mm-hmm. So you think about burrowing owls, you think about greater sage grouse. Yeah. Those species, it isn't any grass that is suitable for it. It really requires, or they really require that native grassland because of the structure. It's different. It's like, saying all forests are the same, but it's not, right? Mm-hmm. So that's some of the context around kind of why those grasslands are gaining more attention.
So, I've seen a really great graphic where it shows sort of the growth height of different species of plant and how we have bird species that have essentially adapted to each stage of height and where they are, in which case it means if that doesn't exist in the landscape, they have nowhere to go.
Exactly.
They can't actually finish their life cycle because they're missing actually that particular species or height of plant. And cropping systems, while very productive in some of these regions because we've adapted varieties, we've adapted crop type to them, even well-managed cropland doesn't necessarily leave these particular plants in place on the shoulder season or over time, and so we still lose this habitat. So this comes to, I don't like having conversations like this that don't have solutions. So, because I am an optimist, and I would like to state for the record, in case anyone is worried about this, I actually find grasslands incredibly fascinating. So my point about them being boring is everybody else thinks that, not me. But I can see where, from a PR perspective, grasslands probably have fallen out when it when we talk about ecosystems, because at first brush they don't seem very fascinating. You really do have to get into them to really understand just how amazing they are and just how much carbon those roots. You talked about the fire coming through. The reason grasslands can regrow is because of that amazing root system and structure under them, right? So
Absolutely.
it's this
Yeah.
phenomenal way of adapting to what may go over, whether that's bison or fire or whatever. But we have certainly ways to protect grasslands and or reestablish them. And conservation easements are one of those ways. We've certainly talked about it here on Real Agriculture as well. How do conservation easements work, and do they work? Do they work to reestablish or only to protect grasslands?
Well, and that's a fantastic question, and I'm glad you framed it that way, because I was actually going to interject at one point when you mentioned, reestablishing grasslands, because there's been a lot of work, and some of the projects I've worked on, and I've some of your listeners may think, oh, this is a tree hugger, Bugs Bunny's kind of biologist guy, but as a consultant, I've worked in every industry, including coal mining and oil and gas and whatnot. So I've and I fully acknowledge that we need a lot of resources to be able to have a functioning society. But at the same time, it really comes down to, again, finding that balance, right? We can't think myopically down one road that everything needs to be turned over, and I also don't think the position and the perspective of we need to restore everything back to what it was. That's not functional either. So on the question of conservation, it's a really good one, right? One of the biggest challenges with native grasslands is the fact that once you've turned it over, it is virtually impossible to get the same thing back, right? It would take some estimates. Again, it depends on the system. It depends on where it is, right? If you had one little chunk of 1/4 section, which is basically a half mile by half mile, it's the old, imperial system in the prairies. But if you had 1/4 section of 162 acres in the middle of a sea of grassland that you had turned over to turn into crop, and you wanted to restore that, that would be a lot easier because it's already in a sea or a matrix of native grassland, right? So a lot of the plants that are going to come back in are going to be native species. And planting that and working it, you'd be able to establish that a little bit easier. The challenge is that those are few and far between. The majority of the landscape is now a matrix of either cropland or areas that have been invaded by a lot of invasive species. Like, we have huge lists of invasive species. And we also have tame grasses that we have turned over native to plant to tame grasses that were largely European grasses, right? That we knew well, we knew what to expect and how to manage them. And sometimes they do outcompete native grasses, and they actually do change the soils a little bit within that. And so they come in, and all of a sudden, it's very hard to reestablish the true native plants that have adapted to that without having a whole mix of either introduced species or invasive species, and some of them are noxious weeds, right? There's a whole list of noxious weeds in the prairies that are basically prohibited. You would get yourself in trouble if it was on your land and you weren't managing it because they are so invasive. And so that becomes the real challenge, is that we have a small remaining amount of this natural ecosystem that evolved in the Canadian prairies, or the broader Great Plains writ large, that has adapted to the climate variability. I mean, you don't understand the extent of the drought cycle until you've lived in the prairies for at least a decade, right? Where you see that when it rains, oh boys, it rains, right? Every wetland's full, birds everywhere, everything is lush. And then when you go through a major drought, like we're just sort of finishing up now in parts around Saskatchewan, where I am, are incredibly dry. Drier estimates are that it's been drier than it was in the 1930s in what we call the Dust Bowl years because of poor agricultural practices. And it's incredible how certain species just really suffer. A lot of the aspen and the poplars around the wetlands on our property are dying back because they're just not getting enough water, right? So there's a dynamic around the evolution of that's really important. And with the little bit that we have left, if we're not able to properly return it to what it was, conservation is basically needs to focus on one, preserving what we still have. That would be key, because if you can't get it back, maintain what you have. And if we've only got 15% left, that means that 85% has been used for some other purpose, whether it's urban development, crop production, etc., right, or hay production. In conservation theory, right, a well-managed landscape, I mean, there's different theories around that, but a well-managed landscape, you might have a third of the landscape that is very heavily intensively managed for certain things, right? Industry, etc. A third that would be sort of this mixed use, and then a third that would be left alone. And that's kind of some of the principle behind the more recent objectives at an international level with the Conference of the Parties, the 15th Conference of the Parties for the basically the treaty around biodiversity conservation that was held in Montreal last 2 years ago. No, I forget, it might have been last year.
I'll look.
And yes, it was last year. It's the 15th Conference of the. So at that Conference of the Parties, it's an international treaty which Canada signed on as well and ratified. They developed the Global Biodiversity Framework, the GBD or GBF. And in that, set objectives that any country that signed on was going to try to achieve. And it states that, amongst, there's a variety of targets in that, but one of them is to conserve 30% of marine landscape. And that's why we see more marine protected areas being proclaimed in Canada, but also 30% of land and inland waters. So if you think about 30%, well, I mean, Canada's a huge country. We could take a large part of the north, designated a national park, and Bob's your uncle. But, most of the biodiversity isn't in the far north, right? It's scattered across the country. And the prairies have an enormous amount of biodiversity, but it's also an area that has the lowest conservation rates. And so if our goal is to get to 30%, and, we'll see if we ever get there. But the objective is by 2030. So you've got a little bit of time left. Some places are really far behind. It's also a challenge because most of the land in Canada is managed by, or, quote unquote, crown land under the province and territorial responsibility. And then there's large areas of private land, and no area has more private land than basically the grasslands region, right? So it becomes a real challenge around conservation. And I think that, a lot of the organizations that are actively working towards conservation, like Nature Conservancy of Canada, Ducks Unlimited Canada. There's a number of others that are, smaller ones like Manitoba Habitat Conservation, Wildlife Habitat Canada. There's a whole range of organizations that are trying to find ways that are beneficial for the landowners if it's private land, and also beneficial towards conserving biodiversity. And you mentioned conservation easements, and that's a really useful tool because the remaining grasslands, for the most part, a lot of them are working lands, right? They are grazed. They're used for pasture. Not as much for native hay, but largely pasture lands. And it's possible with a conservation easement to continue to do that. So it still contributes towards food production and livestock production. It maintains through proper management that variety of the kind of structure of grasslands that you mentioned that provides the habitat that a lot of different species are adapted to, that they're searching for when they come back from migration, especially the birds. They're coming back to Saskatchewan looking for that, right? And so it allows for that diversity, but it also ensures that those lands will be there for the future. And so they're a great tool for that. And, in sort of ecological theory, we also talk about, well, if we have to conserve lands, what's the best approach? Do we want 1,000, 10-acre parcels? Or do we want one parcel of 10,000 acres, same size, just a different approach? And that's what we call the SLOSS, or single large or several small debate, right? What will give us a greater return on investment when it comes to conservation? And the result is you need them both, and you need a mixture of You can't just go one large. You can't just go a whole bunch of small because some species, you think about a herd of bison, need a large area, right? You think about that one, you know, Dakota skipper, which is a little butterfly that basically flies around and has a very small home range. They focus on very specific species that they either feed on or lay their eggs in. They don't need a large area. But to disperse, right, they need a lot of small areas to be able to hop to get to more suitable habitat. And because if one of those basically blinks out, right, the population goes extinct, you need to be able to repopulate it. Otherwise,
Yeah.
the concept doesn't work. So it takes a lot of planning and strategy around that, and it's also why there's a lot of value for landowners that want to take an approach that is a little bit that's more a balanced approach to land use practices. And there are programs. One that's fairly recent is called ALICE, right? Alternate
Yep.
Land Use Systems. And there's compensation to landowners that aren't turning over certain pieces, kind of like a conservation easement, but it focuses on just little parts of that parcel of land. So whether it's a stream, the riparian of a stream, not having
Right.
either cattle going through all of that or not tilling all the way up to the stream edge or the wetland or et cetera. So small parts that are still provide a lot of biodiversity benefits, but still the rest of it is allowed for crop production. So those little pieces can be really valuable to some species, right? But it takes that balance. And then at the other end of the extreme is something like the McIntyre Ranch, which was just under conservation easement just recently. I mean, we're talking 22,000 hectares.
Yeah.
That's
It's huge.
220 square kilometer ranch put under conservation easement. It's been a working ranch for over 100 years, right? Almost, I think, 150 years is what it
Yeah.
is. It's been a working ranch. It will retain, the status of being basically a working ranch. It's just nothing's going to change. It's that at least now we have some certainty that the species that also call that home will have a home
Yeah.
because it's surrounded by very intensively managed cropland, right? And there's the possibility that it could have been turned into that. So,
Mhm.
so there's a lot of tools. There's a lot of options. I think we need to focus where there is still grassland on one, conserving it, and then finding better approaches and finding those some of that marginal land that probably never should have been turned over in the first place. And the really poor class 3 soils, class 4 soils that in really good wet years, yep, you can grow something on it. In the dry drought years of the prairies, you've got 6-inch wheat growing out of the sand. So,
Yeah.
that kind of stuff could probably be turned back. And then you have species that suddenly are more adapted to that, um, those drought conditions because of what you mentioned, right? Very deep rooting. They can get into the moisture much, much deeper in the soil. They have the resilience to withstand the drought. They have the resilience actually to withstand grazing and sometimes do really well when you really
Yeah.
graze them heavy. But they have that resource system in the soil, which also, conserves carbon. It conserves a lot of biodiversity, but also conserves organic matter in the soil, and so helps to rejuvenate that. So those lands, I think there is a lot of potential for restoration, and then maybe alternate agricultural practices that just may actually be more profitable in the end anyway.
Hmm. Okay. We're going to leave it there. Jean-Michel, this is absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.